Alex Bristol, welcome to the Executive Talk.
Thank you.
You have double citizenship. You're British and you're Swiss. You grew up in England, you've worked in Switzerland, you were an executive in both countries. Which is simpler, to be a chef or to be a boss in the UK or to be a boss in Switzerland?
So what you say is absolutely true, and I have led organisations in the UK and in Switzerland. There are quite a number of differences, of course, between the countries, but I think what I find is in Western Europe, a lot of management is management, and it still works. The air traffic world, which I have the honour to lead, is also quite similar as well. So the similarities are much greater than the differences. And what I notice in Switzerland, of course, are the cultural differences that we get between Zurich and between Geneva, but also between the Tessin and the other parts of the country. Those cultural differences mean that different things need to be managed in a different way. And I suppose in some ways that probably adds an extra element of challenge to the Swiss version as opposed to the British version.
So it's more difficult in a way.
It's a different kind of challenge. The challenges in the UK are still there, but they are different. And the ones in Switzerland, for me, it revolves around needing to understand that what works in here in Dubendorf, for example, doesn't necessarily work in exactly the same way if I were to say or do the same things in Geneva.
Was that hard for you coming to Switzerland? I mean, you have a Swiss mother, so I suggest that you must have known the culture and everything. But when you changed to be a leader, to be an executive in Switzerland, did that take some time to get these differences and to know that Geneva isn't the same thing as Zurich or the Tessin?
For sure, absolutely. I mean, my experience of working in Switzerland had been working up in the mountains in the Bernese Oberland, and whilst that helps you understand some of the culture, it doesn't help you understand the corporate culture or any kind of leadership culture. But it does help with certain other elements, like, for example, the Swiss idea of how to be led is different to a Brit, in the sense that if there's a very difficult decision, I as a Swiss person may expect to have some say in this. The basis democracy that exists in Switzerland translates itself also into business in that
even in the workplace.
I would like to have a say in that, which doesn't really exist in the UK, and also the understanding that my expression, if I use English, for example, may be misunderstood by somebody whose native tongue is not English. Those considerations always need to be taken into account, but they didn't necessarily come from my previous experience in Switzerland.
It's very interesting that you might say that people want to have their say and they want to know what they're doing and want to be partly involved, I guess. That can be very difficult as well. I guess that if you don't have sheep, you can just like kind of guide anywhere. But people who are really thinkers as well, how did you approach that dilemma in a way?
Well, it requires a different kind of thinking, that's for sure. But at the bottom of it is my realization that if you have got a company full of intelligent people who want to bring the company further and to bring a positive spirit to bear on it, actually they're the best people that you can possibly use to create the future and to help create the future. So just to take a specific example, as we now work on our strategy for the next years, we start to bring people in. We don't bring people in to tell them what the strategy is. We also bring people in to help us, the executive team, refine the overall strategic direction. So the strategic direction comes from the top, of course, but actually how you build up underneath that, we're trying to do that much more with the people rather than to the people, if you like. And I think that's going to be a much greater chance of success as a consequence of that.
You do work with a specific kind of people, if I may say so. I mean, they're not the cashiers somewhere or some worker in a factory where the result doesn't really matter. Your people take an incredible amount of responsibility in what they do. How does that change your approach to leadership, to kind of guide them through that difficult work sometimes?
There are at least two different aspects for me in that. I think one part of it is that the amount of responsibility which everyone in this organisation knows they carry, and it almost doesn't matter who you are, because everybody in the company has some kind of a relationship to the provision of safety in our airspace. And bringing those people with us is the thing that will make us safe in the future as well. Now, what do I mean by that? I, as the CEO, can't possibly know how to make Skyguide safer tomorrow. The people who know that are the people who are actually doing the job. And so we have to find ways to be able to hear them, to listen to them, to be able to bring that into what we then do in the future and the strategy that we create. And the second part of that is, of course, because we've trained them so highly, and an air traffic controller takes 3 to 4 years to train. So it's not somebody who walks off the street yesterday who's going to be an air traffic controller tomorrow, but somebody who's trained much more. We try and bring all of that in as well. But with that comes their understanding that if I make a decision, I will see the results of my decision like that. And that, of course, is something which generates challenges for the management, because we make a decision, and next year and the year after that, we still don't see a result, because these things take much greater time. And bridging that gap between the decision-making point and the effect point is one of the biggest challenges that I see in this kind of a company.
And you know, if your people, if the employees make a decision, it's often a decision that, you know, might be very, very kind of consequential in the end. Am I right in saying it's probably the job with the most pressure that is even imaginable? I mean, they're doing a heck of a job.
I mean, they do an incredible job. I'm an ex-controller myself, so of course I would like to say it's the most difficult job that exists in the universe. But it's also a job which we train for. So we select and we train people who have an aptitude for that. Yes, it's stressful. And if you were to sit in front of a radar screen every single minute and think, oh my goodness me, these dots represent this many thousand lives, then of course you couldn't do that job properly anymore. Equally, if you sat there and thought, this is just a video game, it doesn't matter, you couldn't possibly do the job either. So we find have to find that balance in the middle, and have to help people to find that balance in the middle. Now, is it the most stressful job in the world? I couldn't possibly say. But what I can say is that we try and manage that stress, and we help people manage the stress in a way that then leads to a successful day's job. Yeah. And most people who walk out of their job at the end of the day do so with a feeling of a light heart and a job well done.
How do you manage that? How do you deal with pressure and the stress? Can you elaborate on this a little bit?
Well, I mean, there are various different kinds of stress, of course. So first of all, the stress that I might have in my office with too many emails to read or something is one thing. The stress that a controller has, for example, in the moment when an aircraft declares an emergency, that's a very different kind of stress. And as I mentioned before, the first thing we do is we make sure that we recruit and select people who are already predisposed to be able to cope
you need to have a kind of a mindset
better with that stress. By the way, there may be other types of stress which they can't cope with at all, but with this particular kind of stress, they're generally more robust. Into the training, we put a lot of things as well to make sure that we help them out. And then after, let's take the example of an aircraft emergency, and I feel myself stressed by the situation. We then have a set of procedures and processes in place, and an amount of support which we can give a controller, which involves third-party interventions and so on, to help them talk through things and to relieve and reduce the amount of stress that they feel as a consequence. But at the end of the day, it is a demanding job, and it requires full concentration and focus from those people while they're doing it.
A crucial thing in that regard is also how you deal with mistakes, because we live in a society where, I mean, yes, it would be nice if no one did a mistake, but of course we all do mistakes. And I think you have something like you call it the just culture in the company, where you're actually telling your employees, if you do a mistake, please tell us, because only then we can learn from them. Is that the right way to?
So you're absolutely correct. So every now and then people say, well, you must operate in a zero mistake culture.
Which is impossible.
Which is impossible. We're human beings. And so much more sound and much longer term worthwhile and safe is to have this just culture that you mentioned. And the idea behind that is, first of all, that you build the system so that it's tolerant of human error. So if somebody makes a mistake, which they of course will do, it doesn't lead immediately to catastrophe. There are then barriers that catch the mistake and help either the person or the system recover. The second element is exactly the one that you referred to, which is in order for us to know about what is not working, and for us to be able to improve it for tomorrow, we have to know what's not working today. And what's not working may be a piece of equipment, or it may be a person who's made a mistake. Now, to take this to myself, when I was a controller in the UK, I had a few incidents where I had made mistakes, and I used to write the report so that the whole system, everybody else, could learn from those. In Switzerland, we try and do exactly the same. We have one challenge on that, though, and that's that the judicial system is different in Switzerland to the way it is in the UK, and that part of it creates more challenges for us. But the overall just culture that we have in Skyguide, in this company, is a very, very high quality one, and the reporting rates that we see are also very high.
But speaking of that one challenge or that one problem, you might say as well, I think at the moment there are 3 law or court cases exactly involving people who did say they made a mistake, but now they're being sued. So isn't that a huge problem in Switzerland, that you can't really rely on that principle of I did a mistake and I reported it, which is the right thing to do, but in the end I'm being punished for it.
It's one of the things that worries me the most in my job at the moment, is the fact that we are on the brink of potentially sliding into a place where safety can't be guaranteed at the high quality that we have it at the moment. I'm very comfortable with what we do at this stage and at the moment. But Switzerland and the judicial system of Switzerland is a number of years behind the rest of Europe and most of the rest of the world in being able to encompass just culture into the law itself. If one just simply imagines the scenario where every time I make a mistake, and a mistake in this sense needs to be understood as I left my mobile phone at home this morning, not I deliberately went to try and kill somebody, or I didn't do my job, or I turned up to work drunk or something. Those are unforgivable. So they are correctly still and should always be pursuable by law. But if I make a mistake, something that just, I forget something, which the system then catches and makes sure that there's no catastrophic outcome, for me, there's no need for the law to deal with that. And we deal with that in a learning basis rather than a punishing basis. That's where the future has to go. But that presents for us, in the whole of Switzerland, not just Skyguide, but for the whole of Switzerland, that presents a major challenge.
But coming back to the question of culture, I think that's something you have to bring across to the employees, that you're standing behind them, and if there's a problem, how do you manage that when dealing with your people who, as I said, have a lot of responsibility, a lot of pressure as well? Do you try to talk to them directly? Are you implementing some kind of leadership principles that should help in that way?
There are a number of different things we try and do in that respect. One, obviously, is face-to-face dialogue. That's a big and major thing. Just after the last court case that we had, I sat down with some controllers in a room just over there in order to exchange on what the situation is, how they feel about it, because, of course, for them, they're understandably and justifiably very worried, and very worried for themselves on a daily basis. And that's not a good situation with which to be going into the kind of job that they have. But it's also much more than that. It's making sure that we talk and we exchange with the prosecutors, we exchange with the law-making authorities. Our minister as well needs to fully support us in this area. It so happens I'm going to meet the new minister on Thursday, and that will be one of the top topics that we have in this conversation. She comes out of the Justice Department, so I'm hoping that she'll have some understanding of the situation as well. But then also we try and work with our people and say, so what happens in the scenario when something should occur, or you should end up in front of a court of law? And there, of course, we provide full support. We provide the lawyers, we provide the arguments that are necessary, and make sure that the person involved feels fully supported. So if you like, slightly ironic situation is that in the incidents that we actually have in front of court, if you were to go to the 3 people concerned and say, do you feel supported by management? They would say, yes, I do. And my job now, and our job in the management, is to make sure that all of the other controllers in the company feel the same way.
And how much in that regard does it help that you have done the job yourself? You said it yourself, you've been a controller, you've been in their shoes. Do you think the team would even accept you if you hadn't done the job. I mean, it's something that, you know, it's almost kind of a family thing, and oh, you can't understand me because you haven't been in the same situation. Could you be the CEO of Skyguide if you had never touched one of those computers?
I think so. I think the CEO role does not require an ex-controller. I'm convinced of that. And I think that the management of organisations like this air traffic control provider called Skyguide has changed of necessity over the last decade or so. Once upon a time, it probably would have made sense for the chief executive to have been a controller. Nowadays, I would say the chief executive needs to be more of a business person and understand business, and to be able to lead an organisation rather than necessarily have the technical background. All of that having been said, there are certain conversations that are much easier for me because I was a controller once, and certain affinities that are immediate. And if I go up into the top of a tower or into the control room here, I just understand what's going on without someone needing to explain it to me, and that helps a lot.
I was just thinking when you talked about business and you know, having to know business, and probably also having to have a knowledge of the airline business, which is, you know, kind of linked to what you do. When you look at the airline business and the business of flying at the moment, where people tend to take more and more flights, and people all around the world are, you know, there's still so many who are not flying, but who will be able to fly. When you look at your job and the job that Skyguide is doing in this regard, aren't we bound for catastrophe at some time? Because more and more people want to fly, but you know, there's going to be more and more kind of risks and more challenges in that field as well.
Well, I'll start with one quite important point. In amongst the airspace users above Switzerland and amongst our key customers belongs the military as well, which is a very important part of what goes on in any nation, of course, but in Switzerland and in Skyguide even more so, because we are the only fully integrated air traffic provider. So we do all of the military air traffic and air defence, as well as the civil. So we have not just the civilian, the airlines to consider as our key customers, but also various others, but especially the military as well. And that means that you're often trying to balance two quite different sets of needs somehow within the same system. The airlines themselves are looking for more capacity. There are more and more flights at the moment. That is absolutely true. The biggest growth areas, though, are in the Far East rather than in Europe. But last year, the whole of Europe saw more than 5% increase in growth, which is a very significant increase in a already capacity-constrained area. And the biggest challenge that exists to us in that sense is the creation of more future capacity without letting safety go, of course, because safety is our top good. That's the one thing that we have to provide. And that's where those delays come from that people get, is what we do in our system. If we get to a stage where we can see that the airspace is already fully loaded, we then keep some aircraft on the ground. That way it stays safe. Okay, it's not good that we delay people, but it's better we delay people than that we have an unsafe situation in the air. And the next challenge is then to create that extra capacity in the air, and most of that will come through new technology.
But how much extra capacity is there? Because, you know, of course there is a technology opportunity or possibility, but there's only so much space that you can actually fill. So, you know, if we keep that 5% growth throughout the next years, there must be a limit to all that.
So there is a limit. First of all, though, of course, our forecasts don't necessarily show 5% each year, because a recession will bring a downturn again, and that's more or less due in the aviation field at some stage in the next couple of years. Secondly, there are other elements around how much people will actually be travelling for business in the future, and how much more will be done by electronic technology. Then there's all of the climate input as well, which at some stage will have some kind of a dampening effect, probably not a downturn, but a dampening effect in Western Europe. In Asia, I could imagine that the growth will just continue to increase. There they've got the space, the capacity exists there. In Western Europe, the capacity is limited by two different things. One is by the separation minima that we are required to employ. So in other words, if you're one aircraft and I'm one aircraft, we must stay either 5 miles apart or 1,000 feet vertically. And as long as we do that, then we can do whatever we want. But of course, there are loads of others around, and they've all got to stay the same distance apart. That becomes one of the limiting factors. And the other limiting factor actually has got nothing to do with the airspace. It's the number of runways available. And in Europe, one can consider the likelihood of an increase in the number of runways in the next decade or two to be limited, because politically that's just not interesting to anybody. So those things create a damper on the growth, but nevertheless the pressure on us as air traffic providers to create new capacity is enormous. And I suspect that one of the places we will find some of that technology that we don't know about today is in the drone area, which is coming along. It will disrupt us in ways that we can't today predict.
Before we enter the runway discussion, which is highly political, as you say, and which would probably fill another interview in its length, just one last thought about that. What do you make of it personally? Because, you know, there are a lot of questions linked to flying, and climate is one thing. Then, you know, the prices, which are probably too cheap, is one thing. How do you deal with it personally? Because you work in that area, but, you know, do you feel comfortable flying, for example?
Well, I have to say I love flying. I've always loved flying. Aviation has been in my blood since I was young, which is why I went into the field, and which is why I began to fly myself when I was 17. And so whenever I get a chance to fly, I do, and I do that very happily. And the really good news about working in somewhere like Skyguide is that I can go to an airport, look at the aircraft, look up into the airspace, and know that I'm going to land safely.
Final topic, a huge one as well, regarding Europe. And I'm not asking the Brit for the Brexit, but I'm asking the Swiss for the framework agreement that is hanging in the air, so to speak. How do you deal with that dilemma? Because I can imagine, you know, the airspace has its frontiers as well, but you work in such an international field, in such a European space, in a way that this must cause a problem for you.
Absolutely. I mean, aviation is a global industry, and it is impossible, or almost impossible, for any nation state to consider itself completely separated and completely isolated from the rest. Switzerland especially not, because we're surrounded by aviating countries that produce a lot of air traffic. Now, without a global agreement with the European Union, we then have a problem, because lots of our agreements which we have don't then have value in law, because the bilateral agreement that Switzerland has made, of course, is with the EU. So the whole thing needs to sit underneath the covering agreement. If we fail to achieve that, then we're actually in a position that's not that dissimilar to the Brexit dilemma, which is we then have to go to everybody and create bilaterals in order to continue with something that's
to every single
state in the EU to create those bilaterals. Now, it's not impossible, but that's deeply unwelcome, and in an interregnum where there is no such agreement, then it's questionable, exactly as the Brits are having to work out at the moment. It's questionable who gets to fly where and who is allowed to fly, and that's neither politically nor financially nor operationally or technically a desired solution.
There's no kind of worst case scenario like a grounding, to stay in the airline speech here, but is there a kind of a really risk that Switzerland might be taken out of that whole control system altogether?
My experience with these things, especially when the interests of lots of different parties converge in the same place, which is to have a functioning and sustainable aviation system, that a solution can be found.
Not unlike Great Britain, hoping for a softer Brexit.
I can hold my thumbs for that one.
Last question, Alex Bristol. I read somewhere that you studied French and German in England. So you already knew back then that you were going to work in Switzerland, didn't you?
Not at all. What I did at my university degree was I took the things that I enjoyed most and I read those at university, always knowing that I would not do a job which required French and German. Actually, the job that I was looking to do would have been more engineering based, if anything. But it was a great pleasure to me when I came to Switzerland to be able to go back to what I'd learned at university and to be able to actually use and translate some of that into real life as well.
And what does that mean for the future? I mean, do you see yourself working in Switzerland until the end of your career, or do you see you might work in the UK again?
I have actually got no fixed ideas on that. The next few years, very clearly, sit here in Skyguide, and I look forward to those a lot. And after that, I'm absolutely open to whatever comes along.
Alex Bristol, thank you very much.
Thank you.